In a world that claims to value human rights, some suffering seems to matter more than others. Ukraine's war has captured global attention, aid, and solidarity, while the crisis in Gaza, unfolding at the same time, often receives far less scrutiny. Why does the international community respond unevenly, and what does this reveal about power, politics, and global priorities? I'm Livia, and today we're going to break down the geopolitical, humanitarian, and policy dimensions of these overlapping crises. We'll examine how alliances, media narratives, and historical context shape perceptions of conflict, why some lives are elevated while others are marginalized, and what these patterns mean for the principles of universal human rights. By the end of this analysis, we'll have a clearer picture of how global double standards operate and what they imply for the future of international solidarity. When Israel launched its military campaign in Gaza in October 2023, Ukraine's initial reaction was unequivocal. President Volodymyr Zelensky publicly expressed support for Israel, framing it as solidarity with a nation under attack, while First Lady Olena Zelenska emphasized that Ukrainians understood and shared the pain of the Israeli people. Kyiv's streets reflected this alignment, massive billboards displaying Israeli flags and widespread media coverage reinforced a narrative of Ukrainian support for Israel. At first glance, these gestures may seem purely symbolic, but a closer analysis reveals a convergence of domestic politics, international alliances, and media influence. Ukraine, already deeply engaged in its own conflict with Russia, was navigating a delicate geopolitical landscape. Publicly backing Israel signaled alignment with Western allies, particularly the United States, and reinforced Ukraine's position as a responsible actor in the global order. Media coverage amplified this message, shaping public perception and creating a narrative of moral and political solidarity with Israel, while minimizing attention to Palestinian suffering. This early response highlights how international conflicts, are often filtered through political expediency. Domestic audiences in Ukraine, grappling with their own wartime anxieties, were presented with a version of the Gaza crisis that reinforced alignment with global partners. Symbolic gestures, such as billboards and official statements, functioned as tools of both diplomacy and domestic reassurance. Demonstrating how media and political strategy intersect to frame international crises. The result was a clear initial stance. Ukraine, despite its own recent experiences of suffering, projected solidarity with Israel, reflecting both strategic calculation and the broader influence of Western narratives on public opinion. The global response to conflict often reveals stark inequalities in how suffering is recognized and addressed. Ukraine, for instance, has received unprecedented international attention, aid, and media coverage during its ongoing war with Russia. Comparatively, Palestinian civilians in Gaza, enduring similar levels of devastation and displacement, have historically received far less consistent support. This discrepancy underscores a pattern of geopolitical bias, the value of human life, and the urgency of humanitarian response, often depends on nationality, strategic alliances, and media framing rather than universal principles. These disparities are evident, in practical terms as well. Ukrainian citizens benefit from broader travel freedoms and visa access, facilitating mobility, refuge, and international advocacy. Palestinians, by contrast, face significant restrictions, making escape from conflict zones, difficult and limiting opportunities for international engagement. This contrast highlights how global systems, border policies, international aid frameworks, and diplomatic priorities frequently prioritize populations deemed politically or economically significant. From a policy perspective, these patterns have profound implications. Nations perceived as allies or strategically important, are more likely to attract rapid humanitarian intervention and media attention, while others remain marginalized. This selective focus, shapes public perception, international pressure, and even funding allocation, reinforcing cycles of inequality. Understanding these disparities is essential for evaluating the credibility of international human rights discourse. when humanitarian responses are man. Influenced by nationality rather than principle, the universality of human rights is called into question. Ukraine and Gaza thus serve man as contrasting case studies illustrating how political considerations, global power dynamics, and media narratives intersect to man, determine whose suffering is acknowledged and whose is overlooked. Historical memory plays a crucial role in shaping public man, perception and policy responses to international crises. In Ukraine, the Holodomor, the man-made famine of the 1930s that killed millions, remains a central element of national consciousness. This collective trauma has heightened sensitivity to tactics of man, deprivation, and civilian suffering, prompting some Ukrainians to draw parallels between their own history and the conditions faced by Palestinians in Gaza. The deliberate targeting of essential resources, civilian infrastructure, and access to food resonates deeply with a society that experienced systematic starvation, fostering empathy that extends beyond borders. This historical lens also allows Ukrainians to view other conflicts through a more critical perspective. Developments in Syria, for example, challenged conventional narratives of national security and defense, illustrating how civilian populations often bear the brunt of geopolitical conflicts. Such comparisons have contributed to an evolving understanding among Ukrainian intellectuals, activists, and the wider public, highlighting the universal patterns of human suffering in war. The past several years have seen the emergence of pro-Palestinian protests in Kyiv and other urban centers, signaling a shift in public awareness and solidarity. At the same time, media coverage has gradually become more nuanced, moving beyond simplistic portrayals of conflict to include humanitarian dimensions and international legal considerations. Journalists and content creators, have begun highlighting civilian casualties, infrastructure destruction, and the long-term humanitarian consequences in Gaza, fostering a more informed and empathetic discourse. From an analytical standpoint, these trends underscore how historical trauma informs both foreign policy and public perception. Collective memory shapes the moral and ethical frameworks through which populations interpret distant crises, influencing advocacy, diplomatic positioning, and media narratives. In Ukraine's case, experiences of past atrocities are not merely historical footnotes, they actively shape responses to contemporary global conflicts, reinforcing the importance of principle-based solidarity and a critical examination of how empathy is extended or withheld in international affairs. Over the course of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, perceptions of the United States in Ukraine have evolved significantly. Once widely viewed as a steadfast ally, the U.S. is increasingly seen as a strategic power with its own interests rather than a partner motivated purely by solidarity. Policies during the Trump administration, including a more conciliatory posture toward Russia, contributed to this reassessment, creating a sense that Ukraine's security and sovereignty were conditional on broader geopolitical calculations rather than consistent support. Economic factors reinforced this perspective. Agreements granting U.S. access to Ukraine's valuable rare minerals and resources highlighted the perception of the country as a resource base, rather than a sovereign nation deserving unconditional partnership. These deals, while framed in terms of economic development or strategic cooperation, underscored how geopolitical power dynamics can prioritize resource access over humanitarian or ethical considerations. This reassessment also has broader analytical implications. Ukraine's experiences mirror patterns seen in the Global South, where external powers often intervene selectively, leveraging strategic or economic value rather than prioritizing human rights or civilian protection. Palestinian territories, similarly subject to international intervention shaped by political alliances, offer a parallel example of how global powers determine which crises warrant attention and which do not. From a geopolitical standpoint, these developments highlight the intersection of military strategy, economic interest, and humanitarian discourse. Man. They illustrate that the distribution of international support is rarely neutral, and that perceptions of allies can shift rapidly when strategic priorities diverge from the expectations of the populations they ostensibly serve. By 2024, Ukraine began recalibrating its approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, reflecting both domestic shifts and evolving international expectations. At the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, President Zelensky publicly recognized the existence of two states, Israel and Palestine, and emphasized that Ukraine would advocate for an end to civilian suffering. This statement marked a departure from Ukraine's early alignment exclusively with Israel and signaled a more balanced, principle-driven foreign policy approach. Concrete actions accompanied the rhetoric. In July 2024, Ukraine sent 1,000 tons of wheat flour to the Palestinian territories through its Grain from Ukraine initiative, demonstrating a tangible commitment to humanitarian assistance. The delivery highlighted Ukraine's recognition that support for human life must extend beyond strategic alliances, even in a context where resources and aid are often deployed selectively. Ukraine's foreign policy also included public critiques of international actions. Following Israel's attack on Qatar in September 2025, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs described the operation as a gross violation of international law, reinforcing the notion that Ukraine was willing to assert moral and legal principles, even when doing so conflicted with established alliances or geopolitical convenience. Analytically, these developments underscore a strategic repositioning in Ukraine's international engagement. By integrating humanitarian action, legal principles, and diplomatic statements, Kyiv demonstrated a willingness to pursue principle-based diplomacy alongside pragmatic alliances. This shift reflects an understanding that credibility and influence on the global stage are strengthened when nations align their foreign policy with universal human rights, rather than simply following political expediency or responding to pressure from more powerful actors. Ukraine's evolving stance thus offers a case study in how states can navigate complex conflicts while maintaining both ethical and strategic legitimacy. The developments in Ukraine and its evolving stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict reflect broader trends in global attitudes toward conflict and human rights. Increasingly, public opinion, media coverage, and diplomatic engagement are shaped not solely by the scale of suffering but by geopolitical considerations, historical narratives, and perceived strategic importance. This dynamic creates a tension between principle-based solidarity, support-grounded in universal human rights, and politics-based solidarity, which prioritizes alignment with powerful allies or selective attention to crises that serve national or strategic interests. Analytically, Ukraine's recent policies and public statements exemplify an attempt to balance these forces. By recognizing both Israel and Palestine, delivering humanitarian aid to Gaza, and criticizing violations of international law, Kyiv has signaled that ethical considerations can coexist with strategic alliances. This approach challenges the conventional model of selective humanitarianism, where support often depends on political convenience rather than universal norms. Media coverage and activism have mirrored this shift. In Ukraine, reporting on Gaza has become more nuanced, highlighting civilian suffering, infrastructure destruction, and long-term humanitarian consequences. Public protests and advocacy campaigns, although affected by ongoing Russian attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, indicate a growing willingness among citizens to engage with international issues through a principle-based lens. From a diplomatic perspective, these patterns suggest that nations can exercise agency in shaping global norms, even amid complex conflicts. By aligning policy, humanitarian action, and public messaging, with ethical principles, states can influence the discourse around human rights, demonstrating that solidarity rooted in universal values is both possible and necessary. Ukraine's evolving response provides an analytical case study in how historical experience, political calculation, and moral responsibility intersect to redefine global humanitarian engagement. As we've examined, the crises in Ukraine and Gaza reveal persistent global double standards in how suffering is acknowledged and addressed. Political alliances, strategic interests, and media framing continue to influence which conflicts receive attention and which are marginalized. Yet, Ukraine's evolving stance, balancing principle-based diplomacy, humanitarian aid, and public statements, demonstrates that nations can and sometimes do align policy with universal human rights rather than purely strategic considerations. I'm Livia, and here at Global Shift Analysis, we explore these complex intersections of geopolitics, ethics, and humanitarian norms. If today's analysis made you reconsider how international crises are framed or inspired you to think critically about the structures that shape global responses, subscribe to our channel, and join the conversation. Understanding these patterns is the first step toward advocating for a world where solidarity is guided by principle, not politics.